everyone! Today I am filming a video about my autism assessment. Now, I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at the age of 12, so the assessment I am going to be talking about is the one that's usually for younger people, kids basically. So if you're a teenager or an adult, the assessment's probably going to be different to this, but there may be some similarities. But I'm just going to be talking about my experience with the autism assessment. So I was referred for the autism assessment because what happened originally was my psychologist that was doing CBT for OCD basically just asked me one day, do you struggle making friends or something like that? And I was like, yes. And then they asked something about whether I have sensory sensitivities, and I was like, yes. And then they spoke to my psychiatrist and I got referred for an autism assessment. So in the autism assessment, for me, it was a multidisciplinary assessment, meaning that there were multiple professionals involved. So it was a paediatrician, a clinical psychologist, and a speech and language therapist, along with my psychiatrist. And they all did different things, different assessments, and shared their knowledge. So the main psychological assessment I did was the ADOS assessment. That's what the one I did. The autism assessments are a lot about observation, so they will look at how you're making eye contact, they'll look at any mannerisms you are displaying. A lot of my tics got picked up in that assessment because they're just watching you a lot. They look at lots of different things, how you're communicating, whether you do back and forth conversations. They have to look at all of this to see whether they can see in the moment whether you're displaying autism traits or not. One interesting thing is that in my autism chicken nugget. In my autism assessment, a fire alarm went off, and that fire alarm, I don't know whether it's part of the assessment or not. I'm feeling like it might be because they were observing my reactions to that, so maybe it was actually part of the assessment. I honestly don't know, but I feel like it might be. Also, if you're watching this and you don't know me or you haven't seen other videos from my channel, you're probably wondering why I am doing movements and vocalizations. These are tics, not caused by the autism, it's something else. But yeah, in the assessment, they also, as well as doing the observation, they also checked some physical things. So they checked my head circumference, they did my height and weight, and did a mini neurological exam. There was a thumb to finger thing. And they also was checking my coordination by the paediatrician was throwing a ball and I had to catch it. So there's a little bit of physical assessment, and they also like in the assessments they don't really assess multiple neurodivergent conditions at the same time. So if you thought you had both autism and ADHD, then you would have to get different assessments for that. However, in my assessment they randomly just said, do you have any birthmarks? I was like, yes, on my leg. And then I showed them my birthmark and they're like, oh no, you don't have that. Because apparently they were wondering whether I had tuberous sclerosis. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but they were wondering for a second if I had that. But then they're like, oh no, you definitely don't have that, because I definitely don't have that. But they're just wondering that because apparently some of the traits that I was displaying were similar to that, but they could tell by my birthmark that I don't have that. But yeah, so they will ask certain questions and look at physical factors as well. They also have to consider other reasons why you may be struggling socially. Like, if it wasn't a social interaction or social communication difficulty, what could it be? And for me, it was quite funny because they were wondering that for me, what if it wouldn't be a social communication difficulty that I have, but what if it's that other kids perceive me as odd because of my tics and rituals, and therefore I struggle to make friends? They did have to consider all of that. But yeah, they had to think whether it was the social interaction difficulty that was making it difficult or whether it was how other people perceived me. Now, for an autism assessment, they have to get quite a lot of evidence as to how you act and how you function, your behavioural profile, basically. So they will talk to or get evidence and information from teachers and your parents. So for me, they sent questionnaires out to my teachers, but I was in secondary school at the time, so they had to send it to 10 teachers, rather than in primary school, it'd probably be like maybe 1 or 2. But they got questionnaires from 10 teachers, and of course my parents had to do lots of questionnaires and paperwork as well. But it was really interesting for me because my penis is too big, not that. It was really interesting for me because in school I didn't display any traits that would show, like, would link to autism. whereas at home I did. So my conditions have presented differently in different environments, and that's actually really common, it's normal. But that was really confusing, because in public it was like I didn't seem autistic, at home I did. So that was interesting for them to try and figure out why that was, but that is actually really normal. I think because the autism diagnostic criteria is set out mainly in terms of deficits and this is what's wrong with you, people might think an autism assessment is like that, but thankfully it wasn't. My autism assessment, they did focus on strengths as well. So they were really nice, and they just observe everything. So they do observe your strengths as well, and they're really nice. They said I was creative and had a wide range of vocabulary, and they said I was delightful, which is really nice. So they weren't like, this is what's wrong with you. Of course, they did have to focus on your struggles so they could diagnose you, but it's not all negative. In the part of the assessment where they were asking about school, it was actually really funny, because they were like, so what's your favourite thing about school? And I said lunchtime and food from the canteen. It's a great answer, but it was truthful. But yes, overall, I think the autism assessment was good. It wasn't stressful or anything, so that was good. The professionals involved were really nice, they're really kind, so that was a good thing. Now, there are sort of lots of different psychological tests. I don't know if that's what they are, but they will check your social interaction and social communication. So they were doing things to figure out how good my sequencing skills were, whether I understood emotions. They would ask me how certain situations make me feel, and they would also try and see if I understood how to act in certain settings. So they would ask me questions about how I find school and things like that, and how to act in school. And they also wanted me to point out synonyms and antonyms, which are similar words and opposite words. And I also did a thing where I had to spot the odd one out, or say what the odd one out was. And also they would check my understanding of idioms, phrases and sayings that don't have literal meaning, and also jokes. The jokes thing was quite funny though, or not funny, if you see what I'm about to say, because the paediatrician would try and see if we could understand the jokes, and most, like, some that I don't understand, but the thing is none of them were funny anyway. So I mean, does that mean I'm autistic, or does it mean the paediatrician has a bad sense of humour? I'm not sure. But yeah, I didn't get quite a few of the jokes, I don't think, but I got some of them. They also had to check my verbal reasoning and how well I could identify others' feelings. They had to see if I could really understand friendships. So they would say, like, what is a friendship? What makes a friend, and things like that. With an autism assessment, they have to take a lot of your history into consideration, of course. So that includes your family history. They'll ask little bits about that. And they want to know lots about how you developed. They asked me what situations I find difficult, what situations are a little bit hard for me, and then what situations I find easy, so that they could sort of get an idea of what my struggles are. They look at a lot of obviously social things, so they try and see how good your word retrieval is. So for me, they asked me to spinach. They asked me to say words related to food, for example, and I'd have to list it. So they would just, anything they could related to socializing and communication, they would test it, because they have to, because autism primarily is a condition that affects social interaction and social communication. So there's a lot of stuff about that, of course. In the assessment with the psychologist, I think it was the ADOS assessment, they kind of tried to see how much imagination I had, social imagination. So they had these objects, and I had to make a story out of them, an imaginative story. So I can't remember it exactly, but something for me was like something to do with space. There was a planet, and I think there was something spaceship. I was actually really creative when I was playing around with these things. So they said I do have a lot of imagination and creativity, and the psychologist would have a conversation, and they also did a child interview, so they'd interview you, but also they just have general conversation to see how you interact with them. And they will sometimes, if you're not interacting as expected, they will try and do things that like they'll hint and they'll give social cues. So in my assessment, they basically would, something was out of my reach, and they had that out of my reach so that I would have to ask to get it back. Chicken. And then something else was the psychologist said something like, you'll never guess what happened, and then they didn't say, it was silent after that, so I had to ask what did happen. So they will do things to try and make you socialise in a way, if you're not socialising as expected, because at the time I really struggled with two-way conversations. When they interview you about your experiences and things, they sometimes ask questions about your friendships, because obviously there's a big part of social interaction, so they ask a lot about that, and they just need as much of an understanding as possible. And the thing is, an autism assessment takes quite a long time. For me, I think it took maybe over a year, and that's because they can't really see you once and tell whether you're autistic or not. I mean, some people do have that, but for me and for a lot of people, it actually takes quite a long time, and this is because I think they have to see how you develop, see if you actually change, see if you actually get better at social interaction and social communication, to see if it's just a phase you're going through or if you are autistic. Thing that happened in my autism assessment that I don't know if it happens in other people's or if it was just mine, but it probably does happen in others, but they had to have videos of me from when I was a baby up until the time when I was at the assessment. So they had that, but in that it was basically just showing my PANDAS symptoms, like videos of me doing OCD rituals, videos of me having rage attacks, videos of me ticking and things like that. So I'm not sure how accurate it was, the videos they got, but the videos from when I was really young were basically to show how I developed and things like that. For me, in my case, it was really interesting because they weren't really sure whether I was autistic or not. Because in some ways I do communicate well. I use a lot of gestures, I can use facial expressions, and I articulate myself quite well sometimes. However, I did have some traits, so they, I think, were quite confused because I did have quite a few autism traits that were causing, they were having a huge impact on my life, but then other things not so much. So it was difficult for them to come to the diagnosis conclusion. And for a while the paediatrician was saying that a lot of my issues can be explained by OCD, which I was already diagnosed with OCD. I was diagnosed with severe OCD at the age of 9. And yeah, they were saying for a while that I have quite a few traits of autism, but not that many. But then I did eventually get a diagnosis of autism, and they basically eventually came to a conclusion. And I remember getting the sheet of paper that they sent through with the results, but it didn't really have much on it. It was really vague, didn't really say much. It didn't give a clear diagnosis, and then the paediatrician told my dad that they would give him a phone call to discuss the results, and then they said something along the lines of, we don't know if Remy's autistic, so we're going to diagnose her anyway. So that's how I was diagnosed with autism. The thing is, with that sort of, the doctors were really uncertain. That made me really uncertain, and for quite a while I didn't think I was autistic. At age 14, well, the beginning of when I was 14, I didn't believe I was autistic, and I remember saying that when I'm older, I'm probably going to try and get rid of the autism diagnosis because I don't think I'm autistic. However, now I'm 18 and I do think I'm autistic. I have a lot of traits now, and they do impact me a lot. So I do now think I'm autistic. But when I was 14, I didn't really have the traits then. I go through phases, like, I don't know. But when I was 14, I just didn't have the traits, and now I do. So now I do think that I'm autistic. They did not refer me to any further services. Like, for some people they can, but for me they didn't think I needed it, so they didn't refer me to speech and language therapy or anything. I was already under CAMS with a psychiatrist and a psychologist, so they didn't really need to refer me anywhere. They just told my parents to, if they need more information, look at the National Autistic Society website, and yeah, that was how it went. And the thing is, my autism diagnosis had both positives and negatives. First of all, the negative was that it made it harder for me to be formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome. I wasn't formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome until I was 15. However, in the autism assessment, they did, in the notes, say something about Tourette syndrome, but that wasn't really a formal diagnosis, and it was really confusing because for a while I thought I was formally diagnosed with Tourette syndrome at the age of 12. However, when they say at the top of a letter, sometimes they'll say your list of diagnoses, Tourette syndrome wasn't there. So I did eventually have to go and see a pediatrician specializing in neurology and get diagnosed with Tourette's. The thing is, a Tourette's diagnosis is actually different to an autism one, because for autism, as I said, for a long time they do appointment and then they'll have a gap and then another appointment. It takes a long time. There's a lot of different things that go on. For a Tourette's diagnosis, it did take me 7 years to get diagnosed, but once I did see a doctor who understood Tourette's, I literally walked in the office and within 20 seconds of being there, he's like, yeah, you have Tourette's. So it was faster, but also slower because it took me long to actually be referred. But overall, it took one appointment to be diagnosed with Tourette's and quite a few to be diagnosed with autism. But anyway, that wasn't the point. Where was I going with this? The autism diagnosis made it harder for me to get the Tourette's diagnosis because the doctors would put it all down to autism. So for a while, the doctors were saying pretty much everything's down to autism. And I've heard this quite a few times. It can happen quite a lot for people with PANDAS, PANS and Tourette's. If they have an autism diagnosis, it can kind of be lumped under that. And that's kind of what happened for me. It was a lot harder to get diagnosed with Tourette's once I had the diagnosis of autism. Chicken nuggets is sexy. The positive of my autism diagnosis was that I feel like it's allowed people to understand me more. I definitely have issues now with social interaction and social communication. And I feel like if I wasn't diagnosed with autism, then people might think I'm weird or rude, and I'd be a lot more anxious because now I don't really care what people think because I know that I'm autistic and I do struggle in social situations, and that's not really an issue. But if I wasn't diagnosed with autism, I'd probably judge myself a lot more. I definitely stopped masking as much once I was diagnosed. I do stim a lot now, and I do not hide my stims. I'm not ashamed of them. You never need to feel ashamed for stimming. So it's definitely allowed me to be myself more, understand myself more, and have a better quality of life because of that. So I feel like if a young person or a child is displaying autistic traits, or if they think themselves that they may be autistic, or if you're a parent who has any concerns, please try and get them into an autism assessment, because getting the correct diagnosis can really help them understand themselves and live a life where they can get the support they need and not be judged so harshly. Because if someone's not diagnosed with autism, people might just assume they are rude or really awkward and uncaring, when actually we're just autistic. Assessment was at a little pediatric clinic. It was part of my local hospital, but it wasn't the hospital itself. So it was a little building, and it was actually really sweet because I went in there, and in the waiting room they had like a sensory light, and it was really nice. So it was a really calming environment, and that was really good. It really helped. I feel that my autism could have been diagnosed sooner, or do I feel like I could have been referred for an assessment sooner? Yes. When I was in my first school, I think I was 7 years old, the head teacher called in my parents, and they didn't say they thought I was autistic, but they did say they think I was having some difficulties. And then when I was like in year 3 or 4, my friend's mum, who's a teacher, said to my mum that she thinks I might be autistic. So I was displaying traits before, but we didn't really think much of it. So the thing is, I've heard this so many times on other YouTube videos from autistic YouTubers. Girls with autism often present differently, and it can sometimes go undiagnosed for a longer period of time because autistic girls can mask and may sometimes appear neurotypical, but they are actually autistic. They are just masking it. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope that this video has been interesting and informative. Bye!